Does Major League Baseball need a salary cap? As of right now, MLB is the only major sports league that does not have a salary cap. Obviously, the NBA, the NFL, so on and so forth, they all have a salary cap, but Major League Baseball doesn't. And with the recent signings by teams like the Mets, does there need to be a salary cap in baseball? There's a lot of talk about this. You have teams like the Mets spending $5 bajillion, and then you have teams like the Oakland Athletics spending $5. You can always have the owners crying poor, saying, how are we supposed to compete with all these big market teams when we play in somewhere like Seattle? And don't get me wrong, Seattle is a big market team. They just tell you they're not. Well, let's dive into this a little bit and see what that means for baseball. The closest thing that baseball has to a salary cap is the luxury tax, which is set at $233 million. The more you go over the luxury tax, the more you're going to pay in taxes, and that's kind of worked as a soft salary cap for the past few years. But some teams, they just don't care, and I think the Mets are obviously the biggest example of that. Steve Cohen, the owner of the Mets, is rich as hell. There's no denying that. And the Mets currently have a projected total payroll of $305 million, with their tax allocations at $347 million, which is over $100 million higher than the luxury tax threshold. The problem for baseball is the Mets don't care. Steve Cohen will just keep spending money. He is literally going to try to spend his way to a World Series title. Just this offseason, the Mets have signed Justin Verlander for $43 million a year, Brandon Nimmo for a little over $18. They re-signed Edwin Diaz to a big contract, so on and so forth. They were also reportedly in on Carlos Correa. Whether or not that's true, we'll never know, but the fact of the matter is the Mets are basically going World Series or bust. If the Mets don't win the World Series in 2023, there's a problem. Where the Mets had a total payroll of around $307 million, the Oakland Athletics have maybe 10% of that at $30 million on their payroll. The only guaranteed salary they have right now is Manny Pena. Everybody else is either ARB1, ARB2, ARB3, or even pre-arbitration eligible. And there is a correlation between spending money and winning games. Of course, there's not a direct correlation, but I mean, it's pretty clear when you have a team like the Athletics who have absolutely no payroll, and then you have a team like the Mets with the biggest payroll in baseball. There's a pretty clear separation between who's winning and who isn't. So if MLB was to implement a salary cap, let's say maybe like $250 million, which is above the luxury tax, but not so far above it that it's ridiculous, would that help Major League Baseball? In my opinion, no. Establishing a salary cap would affect maybe one team, and that is just the Mets. And of course, the owners are going to say, oh, we need to establish a salary cap so we can pay our players less, so players have to accept smaller contracts. But in the end, that's really not the way to make this work. Of course, you have the big market teams like the New Yorks, like the Chicagos, so on and so forth, but otherwise, a salary cap really affects no other team. I mean, look at the Mariners with their $160 million payroll at the highest point. I do think maybe the luxury tax should have a bigger penalty than it already does to disincentivize teams of doing what the Mets have done and sign every big player they can just because their owner has a ton of money. But to be honest with you, I think the best thing that baseball could do is actually introduce a salary floor. Over the past few years, we have seen a lot of teams go through massive tank sessions. We saw the Astros tank for like 5 years. We see the Athletics tanking. We saw teams like the Nationals, the Cubs, all these big teams tank. And it's really not necessarily fair to their fans. With a salary cap, you often see teams not be able to keep their star players. Think about football, where you see star players and basketball star players traded all the time because the teams can't afford to have them on their salary cap. In baseball, I just don't think that would work. I think that the biggest part of a baseball team is the players that you love. And while of course it's a team game, there are those superstar players like a Julio Rodriguez, like a Felix Hernandez, a Kyle Seager, that really set you up for success. And if those players would have been under a salary cap with their team, it's tough to say if they would have actually signed their deals they did. A salary floor, however, incentivizes teams to stay competitive. Obviously, they added a little bit more of a competitive edge to teams by adding the new playoff spot, so now more teams can make the playoffs. More teams that aren't really contending now kind of have a chance to contend. But a salary floor would make it so that teams with big budgets can't just run around and say they have no money and then trade away all their expensive players and not get any good players. We've seen teams like the Tampa Bay Rays do this, where anytime somebody gets above like $5 million, they trade them right away. I think a salary floor for an MLB team could go one of two ways. There could be a hard set number, like maybe you have to spend over like $80 million on your roster. That way, at least you could incentivize teams to go after some of these bigger name free agents. Or you could also go ahead and just make it however much the team brought in that year in total revenue. Like I'm talking gate entry fees, anything they kept from their TV deals, any of their food deals, any of that revenue. It all gets added up at the very end of the year, and then they have to spend like 20% of that. Listen, I'm no mathematician. I don't know what any of these numbers are coming out to right now, but I just think that the salary floor should be something where a team has to spend a certain amount of money compared to what they made in the year prior. That way fans don't have to suffer through rebuilding years like the fans of the Oakland Athletics are currently, while the higher-ups of that team and the owners and whatnot just kind of rest on their laurels and make all this extra money. Now, don't get me wrong, I totally understand the idea of cutting back payroll like the Mariners did when they traded away people like Robinson Cano and traded away like a Gene Segura. I get that. But the Mariners didn't completely tank, and I think that was one of the best things they could have done because this fan base was hungry for the Mariners to just, do something. And because the Mariners didn't completely tank, a few years later, they were relevant again, and now the Mariners have made the playoffs for the first time in 20 years. Especially with the addition of the new wildcard spot, there is a much easier path to the playoffs than there was before, so teams that maybe would have looked like sellers at deadlines before may now be buyers. But then there are teams like the Oakland Athletics that are stockpiling young players, but none of these young players are so good that they immediately look like the Athletics are going to be really good over the next few years. The Athletics are in like a 10-year rebuild period, and that's not fair to the Oakland Athletic fans. Now, to be fair, they also play in the Coliseum, and well, that's not fair to their fans either. Well, I think there probably isn't a good place for a salary cap in baseball. I think a salary floor would be the best thing to happen to this game. Unfortunately, they did not talk about that in the new CBA that was established a couple years ago, so here we are. It'll be fascinating to watch a team like the Mets, who have spent so much money, to see how they do in 2023. I think that this is a team that has to make the playoffs. They have to win the World Series, and if they don't, then their heads will roll. And for the Mets, eventually all these guys are going to just, come to a head and eventually start to not really perform that well, and all those contracts are going to look like an albatross. Verlander and Scherzer have both proven that this is something they can continue doing, but they're getting up there and they're making $43 million a year, accounting for like 15% of that payroll. And this is, of course, something that Jerry Dipoto and the Mariners have been trying to avoid by handing out long-term big contracts. Now, whether or not we agree with that is still yet to be determined, but I do have a video on the screen now that talks a little bit more about their approach to the offseason. I appreciate you guys watching this one, and go Mariners.